Do you believe in taboos? Like how chopsticks shouldn't be stuck in rice, or you shouldn't place your shoes at the door at night, and if someone calls your name in the dead of night, you shouldn't turn around? If you don't believe it, let me tell you a story. Then you'll understand why some things must be believed. My adoptive father was hospitalized and urgently needed money. I was forced to work at a paper crafting shop, but this shop has some very strange rules. Rule number 1. No living person, other than me, is allowed inside the shop. Rule number 2. After the sun sets, the door must be tightly shut. The front door must not be opened at night. If I need to leave in a hurry, I can only use the back door. Rule 3. The paper dolls and paper horses in the store cannot be touched at night. Every night at midnight, I must tend to the pair of figurines I offer. Those figurines are quite unusual. They resemble a couple in a ghost marriage, but instead of the traditional wedding red thread, they are bound together by thick iron chains. The shopkeeper is an old Taoist priest. Strangely, he didn't dare to enter the shop. When I went in, he only dared to watch from a distance. The owner even said he wanted to sign a contract with me, but to my surprise, what he took out was a yellow talisman. After I dripped blood onto the talisman, the owner handed the shop over to me. Then he hurriedly ran away. That night, at the midnight hour, I placed the incense on the incense altar with the doll on it. The incense altar was at least as tall as a person. When I got closer, the doll's eyes seemed to be staring at me. I hurriedly climbed down the ladder. Suddenly, I felt a chill on my back. I turned around to look. It seemed like the paper dolls and paper horses were also staring at me. Paper figures shouldn't have their eyes painted. That's a big taboo. But all the paper figures here have blood-red eyes. I was scared and quickly returned to the back room. At this time, a middle-aged man was furtively standing, not far from the shop. The man had a tattoo on his neck. It looked like a gecko and a bat. Arriving at the shop entrance, the man starts muttering to himself. The feng shui here is extremely negative. The location is a gathering place for vengeful spirits. Daring to open a shop here, none of the family could survive for a day. The things inside are probably all vengeful spirits. The practitioner of black magic presses his eyes to the door crack. The eerie thing was that the paper figures in the room suddenly moved. With blood-red blushes, they all turned their heads at once. They stared fixedly at the direction of the door. With mechanical stiffness and incredible speed, they sensed the chilling aura coming from inside the door. The shaman, feeling some fear, slowly backed away a little over a meter. He looked at the store's position. He analyzed the feng shui of the place again. The entire town is centered around the shop. Forming the white tiger breaks the evil formation. Could the whole town have been built for this shop? Then the thing shaking here must be terrifying. The sorcerer dared not think about it, but he still didn't dare to act recklessly. He then opened the bottle containing the oil. He took out a bat from his pocket. Bat God, I must trouble you to help me check inside. Saying this, he inserted his middle finger into the bat's mouth, allowing it to suck his fresh blood. Red light flickered in the bat's eyes. It then vibrated its fleshy wings, and struggled to squeeze through the door crack. The sorcerer, seeing this, cautiously watched from across the street. This paper shop gives off an eerie vibe everywhere. It's better to be cautious. More than 10 minutes passed. During this time, the bat god inside still hadn't come out. Just as the curse master was about to check what was going on, his face suddenly changed. The bat tattoo on his neck exploded violently. Blood sprayed out uncontrollably. The voodoo practitioner hurriedly pressed his hand against the neck, which was spurting blood wildly. Before losing consciousness, he quickly pulled out a dark green worm, and pressed it firmly against the wound. The worm first burrowed into the voodoo practitioner's neck, then quickly crawled up his neck toward his head. The bleeding was stopped. He stared in fear at the paper shrine across the street. The bat god was killed. What terrifying thing is inside? The sorcerer ran out of the town and into the mountains. But then he felt a strong sense of suffocation. It was as if invisible hands were tightly gripping his neck. He thought he had simply encountered malevolent spirits. He used every means to exorcise the ghosts. But he found it had no effect at all. Just as the curse master was about to suffocate and die, he struggled desperately to pull out a sharp knife. He suddenly slashed open his thigh, ignoring the excruciating pain and the blood spraying wildly. He pulled out a miniature human skull, the size of a cow's eye, from his flesh. The skull's eyes glowed red. This was the spiritual fetus his master had given him to save his life. He let out a loud, desperate scream. "Please, Ling Ying, save me." After saying this, he fainted. When the witch doctor woke up, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his neck. It was burning. It felt as if his neck had been burned by a red-hot branding iron. He took out a mirror. What terrified him was that the gecko and bat had disappeared. It turned into a black handprint. It looked like it was tightly choking his own neck. No matter how the witch doctor rubbed it, it was useless. It seemed like it had grown out of his flesh. What terrifying thing is there in this paper shop? It was able to follow the scent of the bat god and come after me to claim my life, he suddenly exclaimed. Then he immediately became enraged. Spare others when you can. If you want me dead, don't expect to have it easy. Then I found a cemetery. I dug up a body from a grave. I took out a finger-sized bone. It quickly crawled back into the body. Then I smeared it with corpse oil, chanting incantations. The body, which had been still, suddenly began to move. The witch doctor sneered. The zombie worked. He then pointed toward the direction of the town. The zombie howled and ran toward the paper offering shop. At that moment, inside the shop, I suddenly heard someone shouting for me at the back door. I saw the person arriving. I suddenly realized. It was Old Sun from the coffin shop. Old Sun was standing at a distance, and seemed to be very afraid of this shop. I opened the door and walked up to him. "What's wrong, Uncle Sun?" Old Sun sighed and looked at me. "You're such a kind-hearted child. You've helped me a lot. I did what I could." Saying this, they handed me a yellow talisman. "Take this with you. Keep it close to you at all times. Sleep under the bed tonight. Don't pay attention to anything you hear or see. When the sun rises, this calamity will be over." I didn't understand what he meant. "What are you talking about? I don't quite understand. If you want to stay alive, just listen to me. And, you really shouldn't have agreed to run this shop." He sighed after saying that and left. I didn't quite understand his vague words. But I believe Old Sun won't harm me. Do ghosts and monsters really exist? Am I really going to face a disaster tonight? Thinking of this, I quickly gripped the yellow talisman tightly. I returned to the house. A big yellow dog ran over. There can't be any other living people in the house. Animals, however, can. This yellow dog is no ordinary one. I heard from the neighbors that it's over 80 years old. It's still lively and kicking. It's practically a spirit now. This yellow dog used to be very fierce. But now, it's sitting next to me, cowering. It even shows a hint of a pleasing expression. After offering incense to the doll at midnight, I immediately slipped under the bed. Then I remembered something. In the past, when offering incense, I always felt the paper figures standing in 2 rows were staring at me. Although their bodies didn't move, their blood-red eyes seemed to be moving. However, that feeling wasn't there today. It was as if I had become invisible. The paper figures couldn't see me at all. Could it be because of the talisman in my hand? Thinking this, I quickly tightened the talisman. Soon after, a strong wind suddenly started blowing outside. It made a sharp, whistling sound. After the storm, a loud thunder roared. Then a heavy downpour came pouring down. Through the flash of lightning, I saw a shadow suddenly charge towards me. I was so frightened that I panicked and quickly shrank back. But to my surprise, the shadow rushed straight into my bed. When I saw what it was, I relaxed. It turned out to be that big yellow dog. At that moment, the paper figures outside strangely turned their heads in unison. They were staring fixedly at the doorway of the shop. A moment later, a crashing sound was heard. The wooden front door was smashed open. The stench of foul blood drifted in with the wind and rain. At the moment the door was broken down. The paper figurines didn't move, but they all let out eerie laughter. The intruder seemed reluctant to offend the paper figurines. He cautiously moved forward, sliding along the narrow path in the center. The paper figures remained motionless. Only their blood-red eyes followed the movement of the intruder. I was afraid a thief had entered the room and wanted to check, but the dog's paws were firmly pressing me down. At that moment, I remembered Old Sun's words, and shrank back again. A person and a dog anxiously stared at the bedroom door. At this time, Rohu had already passed through the path between the paper figures. He moved to the foot of the 2 puppets. Under the illumination of lightning, the 2 puppets appeared even more eerie and sinister. When Ruchi saw the puppets clearly, his originally calm face was instantly filled with terror. That deep terror. His buttocks rose high. Trembling, he kept forcefully kowtowing. The flesh and skin were torn off, sticking to the ground. Even as cracks appeared in his skull, he dared not stop. Moments later, faint opera sounds came from the female puppet's body. All of the paper figures, including the flesh puppet, immediately tilted their heads to listen. The singing lasted for a few breaths before disappearing. Only then did the corpse knock its head 3 more times with force. It shakily got up. It walked towards the bedroom where I was. I heard heavy footsteps outside the door. The Huang and I were both terrified, but a few minutes passed, and I couldn't hear anything. I thought it had already left. The bedroom door was suddenly slammed open. I was lying under the bed. All I could see were a pair of muddy, bare feet. It kept pacing back and forth in the room. But then, it suddenly lowered its head. I saw its decayed face with barely any flesh. I almost screamed out loud. Fortunately, the big yellow dog beside me pressed its paws on my mouth. The beast didn't seem to notice me and the Huang. It suddenly went berserk. It started wildly swinging its arms and smashing things. In no time, the room was in chaos. Even the window was shattered. The strong wind, mixed with cold rain, poured in instantly. At that moment, the blanket covering me was tossed aside by the beast. The rain outside the window instantly drenched me. The yellow talismans in my hand are getting wet from the rain. The cinnabar on them is slowly fading. The ghoul seems to have sensed my position. Sniffing the air, it slowly turns around. Then, it roars and reaches out its arm, crawling with maggots, towards me. I'm about to be eaten alive by the zombie. But my big yellow dog suddenly leaps up. It bit down hard on the corner of my clothes. Then it charged out the window. The flesh creature sensed the human presence. It chased after Big Huang's position. The tension in my body finally eased. But then I had a thought. If Big Huang gets hurt by that flesh corpse, it would be bad. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the kitchen knife and chased after him. Not long after I left, a strong wind mixed with cold rain poured in through the broken door. All the paper figures started rustling. The yellow cloth covering the incense table with the dolls was also blown away by the wind. Lightning struck almost continuously. In the flash of lightning, the yellow cloth was covered in dense Taoist symbols, and the yellow cloth covering it was not a scent table at all. It turned out to be a coffin, pitch black like ink. Not only was the coffin covered with densely nailed blood-red coffin nails, but it was also tightly wrapped with golden threads and circles. At each corner, there were tiger-shaped soul-fixing talismans. The tiger mouths were paired, all facing inward. Outside the paper store, Old Sun, the coffin vendor, stood in the wind and rain, looking at the front door being smashed open, and the walls of the paper shop knocked down. He still didn't dare to step inside. He only came to the broken wall. After hesitating for a moment, Old Sun slowly crouched down. He grabbed some dirt from the wall and smelled it, then tasted it. Could it be that the entire house is really built from human flesh and blood mud? He stared in shock at the pale red wall plaster in his hand. Then, trembling, he took out a handful of grave dirt and smeared it on his eyelids. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Now his eyes were filled with a greenish glow. He focused again and continued observing the entire paper effigy shop. Sure enough, I found skeletons in all four walls. They were nailed to the walls with thick nails, and the ghosts of the dead were clinging to them. The wronged souls found that someone could finally see them. They hurriedly cried out for help. Their eyes were filled with bloody tears. Old Sun seemed to be startled by the scene before him. He hurriedly washed the grave dirt off his eyelids with rainwater. Then, he ran towards his own shop. Old Sun had left not long ago. A figure reappeared in front of the paper-making shop. An old woman who looked to be over 80 years old. Surprisingly, a parasol gently floated above her head, shielding her from the wind and rain. Mrs. Lu walked straight to the door, hesitated for a long time before stepping inside, but just as her foot was about to land, she was immediately pushed back by three invisible forces. And where old Lu had just tried to step, a ghastly white line appeared. A life and death line made of the ashes of the dead. After taking a few steps to regain her balance, old Lu wasn't shocked. It seems I guessed it would be like this. I simply walked back to the shop entrance, looking at the 2 rows of paper figures, and the 2 dolls at the end of the paper figures. Sigh. More than 100 years, and you still won't rest. How many more lives must be sacrificed? The moment those words left my mouth, the paper figures in the shop suddenly moved. They all turned their heads and stared intensely at Grandma Lu. At the same time, the eerie peaking opera singing tone sounded again. Enter and you die. Leave and you live. A fierce cold wind blew out from inside the room. Thunder rumbled in the sky. Seeing this, Grandma Lu dared not hesitate. She hastily turned and walked towards her own shop. Her left arm was raised slightly. It was as if an invisible person was supporting her. Meanwhile, the sorcerer in the cave frantically looked at the palm print on his throat with a mirror. If the practitioner from the paper shop had been eliminated by him, this mark should have disappeared on its own. But a long time passed, but there was no sign of it fading away. The paper effigy's damn thing. As long as I don't die, it will definitely be you who dies. Just as the witch doctor was casting his spell, he was horrified to find it increasingly difficult to breathe. It felt as if an invisible hand was choking his neck. At that moment, a strange opera singing sound echoed in his ears. The sorcerer immediately became terrified. He struggled desperately, but it had no effect at all. Please, let me go. I won't dare again. He began begging for his life, but all that answered him was the eerie sound of laughter. The sorcerer desperately poured all the insects from his body onto his neck, but the moment the cursed insect touched the handprint, it exploded and died instantly. Soon after, the sound of the opera stopped. The necromancer's neck was also violently torn off by himself. I had followed the footsteps of Big Yellow and the meat vendor all night, but I couldn't find any trace of Big Yellow or the meat vendor. When I returned to the paper effigy shop, I was shocked. I remember the shop was left in ruins by the butcher last night, but today, it's surprisingly intact, just as it was before. It feels as though everything that happened last night was just a nightmare. At that moment, Big Huang suddenly ran out from the door. Seeing that Big Huang was fine, I felt relieved. It must have been Big Huang who scared the butcher away. But the eerie atmosphere in this paper effigy shop still terrifies me. I can't help but remember Old Sun from the coffin shop, who saved my life last night. I think he should know something. He came to the coffin shop. He was about to knock on the door. Suddenly, a faint, weak voice came from inside. It was Old Sun's. Quantum, right? You should come in through the back door. He entered the coffin shop. Inside, there were all kinds of coffins arranged everywhere. Old Sun was lying in a wicker chair in the middle of the coffin. His eyes were wrapped in thick gauze. I quickly asked him what happened to his eyes. He just said he saw something he shouldn't have. Old Sun gave a wry smile and shook his head. I could tell he didn't want to talk about it, so I asked about the strange paper store. When it came to the paper store, Old Sun clearly became very wary. Immediately shakes his head repeatedly. Quantum, it's not that I don't want to help you, but I really don't know much. I can't help. In any case, that shop is extremely sinister. If you want to live a little longer, you must strictly follow the rules. There can't be the slightest mistake. Hearing his words, if you want to live a few more days, could it be that I don't have many days left to live? Old Sun saw my distress, sighed, and spoke. Uncle can't hide it from you. Before you, several young men around your age have been here. None of them lived longer than a month. All of them died suddenly and inexplicably. What the heck? So you're saying I only have about 10 more days to live? I immediately panicked. I hurriedly asked if there was something dirty in the paper shop. Old Sun heard this. He repeatedly shook his head, indicating he didn't know. He didn't dare to say either. Old Sun let out a sigh. He reached out and slowly untied the cloth covering his eyes. A pair of gleaming green eyes were visible. The things in the paper-making shop are getting more and more eerie. Old man, I only took a glance. And I ended up looking like this, neither man nor ghost. Is it still possible for me to run now? Old Sun let out a sigh. It's too late to run. You signed a ghost contract with the Taoist in charge of your shop. If you dare to break it, vengeful spirits will come for your life. Also, your movement is limited to a 50-mile radius around the shop. If you exceed this range, ghosts will descend upon you immediately. Hearing this, I was extremely angry. So can I burn this lousy shop down? But Old Sun told me, I've already become one with the shop. Burning down the shop would also harm myself. Last night, the window of the paper shop was broken. One of my eyes was indeed injured. He said that to escape this calamity, I can only find a true master to guide me in my cultivation. But how easy is it to find a master? Whether I can find one depends entirely on my fate. I thought I didn't have much time left to live. I stumbled my way to a Bowsy shop. I ordered over a dozen meat buns. If I'm going to die, I might as well die with a full stomach. Just as I was wolfing them down, suddenly I realized there was a strange person sitting across from me. His face was ashen. His cheeks were sunken. He looked like a dried corpse. He was sitting across from me. His gaze was fixed on me. I felt uncomfortable under his stare. I had no choice but to ask the boss to pack it up and take it back to the paper figurine shop to eat. I was about to leave. Then the man walked over. Brother, this paper effigy shop is yours. Not bad, not bad. The man's smile was very strange, which made me uncomfortable. His sudden greeting confused me. I wanted to ask, but he gently patted my shoulder. Then he left. But what I didn't know was, when he patted me on the shoulder, he not only snatched a strand of my hair and took it away, but also dropped a small gray pellet into my soybean curd. After returning to the paper shop, I finished my takeout food. I remembered Old Sun's warning that I couldn't leave the shop for more than 50 li. Since I've finished my last meal, it's time to hit the road. I got on my old bike and headed straight out of the town. Actually, I was somewhat skeptical about Old Sun's words. I just wanted to see what would happen if I walked out. And also, I figured I wouldn't run into any experts in the town. They must all be in the mountains. If it's truly fate, I will be able to survive. The sky is getting darker. I enter a forest. The further I ride, the more uneasy I feel. It feels as if with each step I take, I will be doomed beyond redemption. I don't know how long passed. Suddenly, I feel a sharp pain in my chest. It was as if my heart was suddenly gripped by an invisible hand. Unable to pump blood, unable to beat. Immediately, I couldn't muster an ounce of strength. With a thud, I fell from my bicycle. The ghost contract was real. Enduring the intense pain in my heart, I struggled to crawl back. The higher I climbed, the more my heart ached. After struggling for a long time, I finally felt the pain lessen. I slowly got up, but then, it started raining heavily. I thought about finding a place to take shelter from the rain. Suddenly, I noticed a light in the distance. And faintly, I heard the sound of opera singing coming from the rain. I immediately realized something was wrong. In the dead of night, in the wilderness, how could anyone set up a stage and perform? Who would they be performing for? After thinking for a moment, the answer became clear. If there's no one to listen, it must be ghosts. When I realized this, I quickly grabbed my bicycle and ran. But no matter which direction I ran in, the ghost play always appears directly in front, and it gets closer and closer. The most terrifying thing is, I realized my body was starting to lose control. I was actually walking toward the stage on my own. I was forced to walk to the front of the stage. I found that no rain could get through. The area under the stage was packed with spectators. There were several flower seller actresses on stage with pale faces, singing while pinching their fingers. Since you've come, sit down and enjoy the show. A waiter dressed as an innkeeper led me to an empty seat. He brought tea and a few pastries and placed them in front of me. I took a careful look. I nearly gagged. There was a wriggling big sister floating on top of the tea. The pastries had already rotted. Various maggots kept crawling in and out. Seeing that I had no intention of eating, the waiter clearly became anxious. he asked in a sly tone. Why aren't you eating? At that moment, the people around who had been watching the play, all stood up and tightly surrounded me. He stared at me with dead, gray eyes. In this moment, I was nearly scared to tears. I wanted to get up and run away, but my body still wouldn't obey. The innkeeper stretched out his half-rotten hand, and grabbed a pastry filled with maggots, ready to shove it into my mouth. At that crucial moment, a clear voice rang out. Enough. The reputation of our Northeast Sien family has all been ruined by you lot. After the voice, I saw a young man in ancient costume appear before me. I don't know when. He appeared in front of me. The surrounding crowd was clearly very afraid of him. I timidly returned to my seat. The young master paid no attention to them. Take me away from here. I looked back in that direction. There was no one there. Only a few weasels dressed in costumes. They were standing on broken coffins, making random gestures. The surrounding area was filled with desolate graves, and those so-called spectators are sitting on top of graves. They are also all weasels, and each one has a skull on its head. The young master began to explain. This young man, don't misunderstand. They are not part of the legitimate Huang family. They are just small households practicing their own cultivation. Our Huang family direct line only accumulates virtue and does good deeds. It absolutely wouldn't harm anyone. I pondered for a moment before realizing. Wasn't this exactly the Chuma Xian that shopkeeper's son mentioned? The Huang family spirit among the fox, yellow, white, willow, and gray spirits. I realized that this person was the expert who could save my life. I immediately wanted to plead with them, but at that moment, a sharp abdominal pain came. I screamed and fell to the ground. I discovered in terror that my stomach was rapidly expanding. In just this short time, it had already become like that of a woman about to give birth. Immortal, save me. After shouting those words, I immediately blacked out. At the same time, in the deep mountains and forests on the other side, a man with the appearance of a subordinate official was sitting cross-legged on the ground. He was muttering incantations that others couldn't understand. It was the strange man I encountered that day. Before him lay a ghastly white cow skull. The incantations finished, the strange man took out a bottle of viscous oil, and dripped it drop by drop onto the cow skull. You're doomed now that you've fallen for my trick. He then reached up and grabbed the back of his head. A bullet-sized hole appeared at the back of his head. He actually pulled out a live shrimp from inside. It's already starting to rot so quickly. With a sinister grin, he put the insect in his mouth and chewed. He sat down again, crossing his legs, and chanted a spell. But this time, he chanted even more urgently. The weirder he chanted, the bigger my stomach grew. The young master standing nearby was startled at this sight, then quickly knelt down and placed his hand on my stomach. Since we've met, it's fate. I'll save you this time. He also began to chant. Then there was a poof sound. A whole cowhide unexpectedly came out of my mouth. The young master folded the cowhide, and put it in my bag. Then he took out a pill and fed it to me. I see you have the fate of a Wugui child. You are destined to eat yin and yang rice in this life. When you are capable enough, use this rawhide to find those who harmed you and take revenge. After the young master finished speaking, he transformed into a yellow weasel over a meter long and ran into the deep mountains. When I woke up again, it was already late at night. I found that the Huang family spirit had left, and I couldn't help feeling down. But after I looked at my watch, I couldn't care about much else. It would be 11 o'clock in just over an hour. I haven't offered incense to the 2 figurines in the shop yet. After the lesson just now, I don't want to break the rules again, and cause any spooky trouble. At this moment, though, someone more anxious than me was a big yellow dog. The yellow dog stood in the middle of the shop, glancing now and then at the old-fashioned wall clock. He glanced at the figurines on the incense table. The dog's eyes were filled with terror, as if, once the time came, something incredibly terrifying would happen immediately. Watching the time tick closer, De Huang gritted his teeth and ran toward the door. He shoved at it with his head, but no matter how he pushed, the door wouldn't budge. Just then, the wall clock chimed. Midnight had arrived. The paper figures standing in 2 rows instantly came to life, jerking their heads rhythmically. They began to move mechanically towards the shop in trance, their blood-red eyes fixed on the myriad lights outside, like long-suppressed evil spirits. I want to struggle out of hell. Enjoy the bloody feast to your heart's content. Seeing this, the big yellow dog was so scared it whimpered softly and backed away repeatedly. When it almost reached the door, it finally mustered its courage and stood in front of the paper figure. Seeing the big yellow dog blocking its way, the paper figure actually stopped moving. De Huang stopped them, but dared not make any other move. Unfortunately, there were simply too many paper figures. De Huang could stop one, but not a whole group. Most of the paper figures were already very close to the shop's door. Their greedy expressions grew more intense. De Huang's loud roars were useless. But just as the first paper figure was about to cross the threshold, the lifeline that had stopped Granny Lu on the rainy night reappeared. As soon as the paper figure stepped on it, it immediately screamed and retreated. Seeing this, the rest of the paper figures immediately stopped in their tracks. They dared not approach. Life and death are separated by a thin line. The living outside cannot enter, and the dead inside naturally cannot easily come out. The sudden change of events not only relieved Big Yellow Dog, but also Old Sun and Mrs. Lu hiding in the shadows. The elderly couple looked at the sky, their voices still filled with worry. Where on earth did that child go? Without him, the 5 ghosts' child suppressing the fate. I'm afraid the lifeline alone can't stop what's behind the paper people. It turned out that the elderly couple's concerns were not unfounded. About 2.5 hours later, a mournful and ethereal Peking opera aria suddenly echoed from the paper-making shop. Hearing this aria, Old Sun from the coffin shop and Grandma Lu turned pale instantly. This is bad. They really woke up. Before the words were finished, the 2 figurines in the paper effigy shop suddenly opened their eyes. Their eyes were a sickly green. Then, as if weightless, they floated down from the standing coffins in unison. After landing, they floated toward the door. The iron chains that had locked them dragged on the ground behind them, making a clattering sound. The paper figures saw the 2 puppets come to life, and immediately got scared, standing to the sides. They cleared the path in the middle, which was covered in yellow paper. They lowered their heads and obediently stepped aside, as if they were servants before an emperor and empress. Old Master Sun and Granny Lu held their hands tightly, and hesitated, wondering if they should fight them. But the 2 puppets suddenly stopped. At the same time, the life and death boundary separating the inside and outside of the shop appears once again. The 2 old men thought it was the life and death boundary that was blocking them. But what they didn't know was, a hand reached out from the coffin. At this moment, the hand was firmly gripping the iron chain. No matter how much the 2 puppets struggled, it was useless. When the paper people saw this hand, they were even more terrified, like mice encountering a cat. Even their blood-red eyes were tightly shut. At that moment, I was also pedaling hard on my old bike. I arrived at the paper shop's door. I hurried inside to check the situation. Old Sun and Granny Lu were hiding in the shadows. They didn't want to reveal their identities, so they ignored me. The Big Yellow Dog wanted to tell me what had just happened. Unfortunately, I can't speak. The moment I hurried into the paper shop, a magical thing happened. I saw the paper figures and dolls instantly return to their places, as if they had never moved. And the hand that had stretched out from the coffin disappeared. I saw everything was normal, and couldn't help but let out a long sigh of relief. I greeted the confused Big Yellow Dog and sent it back to its den. I hurriedly closed the shop door. When I followed the rules and offered incense to the 2 figurines, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with them today. It wasn't just the 2 figurines. Even the entire paper-making shop seemed colder than usual. I couldn't understand why, so I walked towards my little room. Suddenly, I felt something at my feet. He bent down to pick them up, but they were several blood-red coffin nails. Coffin nails that were originally nailed to the bottom of the coffin of the puppet. On the other side, Old Sun and Mrs. Lu, seeing the crisis had passed, quietly left the vicinity of the paper-cutting shop. As they were parting, Mrs. Lu suddenly asked his Uncle Sun, "How many young people have come to the shop so far?" Old Sun, upon hearing this, became even more serious on his already somber face. "The 9th one. 9 is the limit. If it can be suppressed, it will be suppressed. If it can't be suppressed, and if you want to protect this child, only the path of offering incense to the deity will work." But the elderly couple found it difficult. Finally, Old Sun proposed. Only Zhang Banxian from Lushu village might be able to do it. Lupa couldn't help but look puzzled. Old Sun should know that Zhang Banxian is from a heretical temple. Why would he ask her to help Youyang's child? Heretical temples don't worship orthodox deities, but they worship wild immortals. As long as the mountain spirits and ghosts can help them cultivate, they will worship them. Some of these wild immortals were even seized. They don't have the ability to invite legitimate immortals. They can only rely on crooked ways to kill and steal immortals. Some evil halls don't even spare their own disciples. Zhang Banxian is from an evil hall. But now, Grandma Lu also has no way out. She can only try treating a dead horse as if it's alive. I slept soundly through the night. I actually didn't have any nightmares. Usually, there would be dreams where paper figures would be staring at me. But as soon as I got out of bed, I tripped over something soft and squishy. I looked down. It instantly startled me. It turned out there was a person lying on the ground. He was a tall young man in ancient costume, dressed in what looked like a dragon robe. He was so handsome, it didn't seem real. I quickly tried to wake him up. After he stood up, he didn't say a word. He just stared into the distance. Seeing he wouldn't speak, I didn't know who he was. So I let him stay at my place temporarily. He had a gold token with a Lord character on it, so I gave him a name. Wang Yukai. My name is Zhao Yuliang. Sounds like we're brothers. I treated Wang Yukai like my own younger brother. I even bathed and scrubbed his back for him, but I was surprised to find on his back a tattoo of a strange dragon with ribs and double wings, completely black and shimmering with a metallic luster. It roared up to the sky. I became suspicious. Could my cousin be involved in organized crime? At this moment, another question occurred to me. Isn't it forbidden for the living to enter the paper shop? Then how did Wang Yukai get in? Does that rule about no living person entering not apply? I placed breakfast in front of him, but he wouldn't eat. I had no choice but to pour the leftover food into the dog bowl. I pointed at Wang Yukai and spoke to the Huang. Dog, my cousin Wang Yukai is staying with us. You can't bite him. The Huang lifted his head upon hearing the sound. He froze for a moment. Then his face filled with terror. He bit my pant leg and desperately tried to drag me toward the door. His strength was so great that he almost caused me to trip. What are you doing, dog brother? I struggled to pull back. Wang Yukai slowly walked out of the house. The big yellow dog immediately calmed down when it saw this. It lay on the ground and whined softly. Wang Yukai paid no attention to the dog. He just quietly watched the direction of the shop's big light. I took the opportunity to explain the rules of the shop. I don't know if Wang Yukai understood. Anyway, it was the first time he nodded. At this moment, old lady Lu came to my door. She said she had found someone to help me with the offering. She told me to prepare food and treats for the immortal. It was a matter of my life. I hurriedly agreed. I told Wang Yukai to hide in the room. Get the food ready. Soon after, old Sun led a middle-aged woman in through the back door. The moment I saw this woman, I felt very uncomfortable. Zhang Banxian's cheekbones protruded, his skin sunken. It was all bones wrapped in skin, like a grasshopper that's become a spirit. Zhang Banxian glanced at the paper offerings shop. Then she began to complain about old Sun. If you had said it was such a sinister place, even if you had carried us in a palanquin, we wouldn't have come. Old Sun said a lot of nice things, but Zhang Banxian still didn't want to agree. Just then, she suddenly tilted her head as if listening closely. After a moment, they started chattering into the air. They said a bunch of things I couldn't understand at all. Zhang Banxian glanced complicatedly at the front hall of the shop. It was where the paper figures were displayed. There was fear. There was greed. As if they had finally made up their mind. They gritted their teeth and agreed. But to be safe, I took a huge yellow cloth and hung it between the backyard and the front yard, completely separating the paper-making shop from here. Then I got some stove ash, mixed it with water to make ink, and wrote the 4 large characters, Chu River Han border, on the yellow cloth. Zhang Banxian wrote as he went along, muttering something under his breath. Seeing that there was no reaction from the paper offering shop in his front yard, Zhang Banxian's anxious heart finally settled down, so he shifted his legs, and sat cross-legged on the chair in the middle, muttering something mysterious again. I couldn't understand the words. Then his body began to twitch. When Zhang Banxian opens his eyes again, his eyes have turned yellowish-brown, and there's no trace of human emotion left. They are cold and lifeless. Old Sun immediately whispered a reminder. Quantum, remember to be respectful. This is a celestial being possessing him. As soon as Old Sun finished speaking, Zhang Banxian spoke up. His voice had completely changed. It became sharp and piercing. So, you want to take the incense, huh? I hurriedly nodded repeatedly. Please, immortal, grant me this. Zhang Banxian glanced at me with his yellowish eyes for a moment. Then, with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, he said, the 5 ghosts' child's fate. Born to live on both yin and yang. Look at me, what do I look like? I understood the first half of the sentence, but the second half left me stunned. Grandma Lu hurriedly opened the umbrella she was using as a cane, and held it above my head. The moment she opened the umbrella, at first, I felt my vision blur. Then it gradually became clear. I looked at Zhang Banxian sitting in a meditative posture. That was no longer a human face. Although I had seen ghosts a few times, this was the first time I'd seen a grasshopper turn into a spirit. In my panic, I kept backing away. Looks like this is what they call an immortal. Zhang Banxian could tell from my reaction that I must have seen something. He gave a half smile and glanced at Grandma Lu, who was helping. Alright then, though there's a hint of taking shortcuts. Even if you've opened the yin-yang eye, you've passed the first test of the exorcism. I'll give it to you, kid. Speaking of which, Zhang Banxian beckoned me. First, let's get this straight. If we can't invite Huang Hui Xianjia to oversee things, old immortal, I'll allocate some of the immortals from my own hall to you all. Lu Pupa doesn't want me to establish any malevolent immortals. She wanted to help me. But these immortals started acting up, since they looked down on my immortals. Why are you provoking me? What's going on? Do you want to arrange a fight and have me bring my people to take you on? You're trying to get into a confrontation, aren't you? Old Lady Lu could only quietly sit aside and say nothing. Go ahead. Bring a stack of yellow paper. We'll help you write the list. The so-called hall list refers to the names of deities that the disciple sets for the hall to invite. The rules here are complicated, but this deity hastily wrote down a few names on the paper. Granny Lu frowned tightly. There isn't a proper Hu Huang by Lu Hui family among them. They're all names of strange, unheard of beings. And once each name was written, it didn't have the compassionate aura of an immortal. Instead, it was filled with a chilling, evil energy. After the immortal finished writing the offering list, he had me start the offerings right away. There were no further procedures afterward. He only reminded me to offer meat and food on time. After the immortal left Zhang Banxian's body, he appeared even more haggard. Zhang Banxian reminded me not to sleep at night. I had to stay at the back door to greet the immortals. As night fell, after settling my cousin Wang Yukai, I stood at the door holding a black umbrella. I used the umbrella so I could see the immortals. While I was waiting there, bored, I noticed someone standing alone under the streetlight. Grandma Lee, who lives near me. But I only heard this afternoon that she was sick and went to the city hospital. Why did she come back in the evening? Seeing her all alone, I hurried over. Grandma Lee, what are you doing here all by yourself? It's windy at night. It's alright, let me take you home. Old Mrs. Lee was startled to see me run to her side. Then she shook her head and sighed. Silly child, you shouldn't have seen me. Just then, a bus pulled up. It was that same ghastly white bus. It didn't even need a signal. It slowly stopped in front of old Mrs. Lee and me, and opened the car door. When old lady Lee saw this, she didn't hesitate and immediately walked towards the car. I followed her closely. I wanted to ask where she was going, but then I saw a familiar face. Zhang Banjian was sitting in the seat. Grandma Lee quickly pushed down hard. You little brat. What are you thinking, getting on that? Aren't you afraid of dying? I was pushed down. I was surprised to find that Grandma Lee was surprisingly strong. At that moment, I snapped back to reality and realized there was no driver on the bus just now, and there are no buses like this around here. I watched the bus disappear from view. Grandmother Lee's voice echoed softly in my ear. Child, don't wander around holding an umbrella at night anymore. You'll bump into ghosts. The voice scared me so much that I dropped the umbrella and hurried back to the house. When I got inside, I suddenly felt something in my hand. A piece of dark wood. Wood with a strong odor of decay. I thought for a while before I remembered. The wood was apparently the handrail from that gaudily colored bus just now. It scared me so much I immediately wanted to throw it away. Unfortunately, I couldn't shake it off. The wood stuck firmly to my palm. Then came a wave of bone-chilling cold. I saw the wood in my hand turn into a wisp of black smoke. It zipped right into my body. No way, this thing can possess someone. Just when I was at a loss, I suddenly heard a chattering sound coming from outside the door. The sounds were sharp and fragmented, and extremely irritating. I saw 8 blurry figures floating toward my back door. The number was exactly the same as the list Zhang Dianxian had written for me. The immortals have arrived. Upon realizing this, I had no mind to care about any wooden items. I quickly lit 3 incense sticks and respectfully stood to the side with my head lowered. I muttered, "Welcome, esteemed immortals." The 8 immortals were also taken aback by my actions. They wondered how I had opened my yin-yang eyes. I led the immortals to the memorial tablets I had set up for them. I saw that these evil immortals all had animal heads. Their plaques were crooked and misaligned. There wasn't a trace of the grace an immortal should have. I couldn't help but wonder, are these really immortals? Meanwhile, in a dense forest, the man with the ox-hide hat who had cast the spell on me, upon learning I was still alive, came to a mass grave. A sharpened peachwood stake was driven into a new grave. It was only stopped when it reached the flesh. Then a bottle of unknown liquid was taken out and poured down the peachwood stake. While pouring, chants that others couldn't understand were muttered. After a moment, a scream was heard. Immediately, a female ghost violently emerged from the grave. She charged straight at the man with the conical hat. The man with the conical hat wore a sinister smile. I took a piece of hemp rope soaked in the oil of measure, and tied it around the ghost woman's neck. Immediately, the ghost woman began to thrash, choking. It was as if an ordinary person was being strangled. Seeing that the ghost woman did not dare to resist, I took out my hair, and ordered the ghost woman, "Kill him." The female ghost didn't dare to hesitate. She forcefully tugged her hair back. Letting out a scream, she drifted towards the direction of the town. At this moment, the big yellow dog seemed to sense something. It barked wildly at the door. The female ghost outside was very afraid of the big yellow dog. She hesitated for a long time and didn't dare to enter. In the end, she had no choice but to take a detour to the side. She peered into the paper shop through the window. This immediately caused a reaction from the paper figures inside. They all turned their heads towards the female ghost. Some of the paper figures even giggled, and slowly walked towards the window. Seeing this, the female ghost was startled again. She screamed and ran away. After running for a while, she saw that no one was chasing her. Hesitating, I returned to the back door of the paper-burning shop. But this time it was worse. Before I even entered, I was surrounded by 8 immortals from the spirit shrine. Ouch! They're here to steal our food. They want to harm the grieving soul we just received. The poor female ghost is just an ordinary wandering spirit. How could she be a match for these evil immortals who have cultivated for over 100 years? Immediately terrified and shaking uncontrollably, one of them shouted towards the shop, "Little Quantum, something wants your life. Shall we step in and handle it? We agreed beforehand. For this deal, you need to give up a year of your life. Right now, I'm sleeping soundly." Suddenly hearing someone calling, I thought I was dreaming. So, in a daze, I groaned. The 8 evil hall immortals were overjoyed when they heard the response. The female ghost screamed a few times and then fell silent. Looking at the hemp rope that had fallen to the ground, one of the evil hall immortals spoke again. "Still someone else's. A small quantum. Let's go and kill those guys in the back. Just so we're clear, you'll have to give up 2 years of your lifespan this time." and I mumbled an affirmative response again. The Xia Tang immortals smiled in satisfaction upon hearing this. Then they transformed into various animals and ran towards the direction of the mass grave. But one of them was missing when they returned. It was clearly a mutual destruction. The 7 Xia Tang Xian seemed to have angry expressions. They complained that the man in the straw hat was difficult to deal with. He had cost them their brothers. Then, without a word, they sucked at me while I was asleep. My 3 years of lifespan were sucked away again. The 7 Xia Xian all showed satisfied expressions. Where was there any trace of the pain of losing their companions? What these evil immortals don't know is that Wang Yukai, who is by my side, witnessed everything. To be precise, these evil immortals didn't even notice him. The next day when I woke up, I felt completely exhausted. The big yellow dog looked at me with a complex expression. Its eyes were full of sympathy. I felt utterly confused. At this moment, Wang Yukai was sitting upright in the living room. I stared in the direction of the side room. After greeting him, I went to cook for him. Unexpectedly, Wang Yukai actually spoke. Do you have a lot of years left to live? I didn't even think about his question. Instead, I was delighted to find that my cousin wasn't mute. Ha ha ha. Cousin, you can talk. You made me worry for so long. Then I quickly asked where his home was. I asked if he needed me to take him home. Faced with this barrage of questions, Wang Yukai showed an expression of helplessness. He turned around and ignored me. But I still went on, telling him the story of my childhood. When I finished making dinner, I asked, "Hey, cousin, what's your name, exactly? Where do you live?" "I don't remember anything," Wang Yukai responded. Hearing this, I felt even more sympathy for him. "It's okay if you don't remember. From now on, you can live here. Why don't you just be my cousin?" Wang Yukai fell silent for a long time after hearing this. He said faintly, "Okay." The moment that single word left his lips, I instantly felt my body less fatigued. The world before my eyes seemed clearer as well. At that moment, a siren wailed outside. I heard they found a corpse in the mass grave yesterday. It looks like it was bitten by wild animals. There wasn't a single intact spot on the body. The police are going door to door asking if anyone is missing. The officer who came is an old acquaintance of mine. He just asked a few simple questions. Before leaving, he kindly reminded me that a batch of prisoners is going to be executed at the prison soon. If you want to attract business, go and have a look. After looking at the photo the police gave me, I was a bit startled. Damn, isn't this the bald gang? And I didn't notice. The death row inmate in the photo had a flash of green light in his eyes. Before I left, I reminded Wang Yukai to stay home and not go out. "If you're bored, you can help me make some paper dolls." Wang Yukai frowned slightly and spoke. But, outside the execution ground, there were already quite a few vendors selling bodies. I walked in and started chatting with them. After a while, a few people walked over from a distance. All the vendors immediately realized these were the victims' family members, so they quickly gathered around to promote their products. Who would have thought that none of them bought anything? They just smiled bitterly and said they brought their own. Seeing that the business couldn't be done, I had no choice but to head back. This execution ground is one of the 4 great evil places. Who in their right mind would want to stay here longer? But after walking back for a few dozen meters, I could still vaguely hear people talking quietly. They were talking about Old Master, Fortune God, and Great Tomb. 7 mournful stones, curses, self-inflicted hexes. Formations. These are words I don't understand. I wonder when my ears became so sharp. Then I start worrying about how I'm going to feed my cousin and Big Huang when I don't have a penny on me. I need to figure out how to support them. Back at the paper shop, I was surprised to find that in such a short amount of time, my cousin had already made 2 paper figures, and they looked like works of art. The 2 paper figures gave off an extremely proud feeling. Only in front of Wang Yukai would they bow down. Everyone else is trash. I curiously reached out to touch them, but a tremendous force came from the paper figures. Luckily, Wang Yukai pulled me back, preventing me from falling to the ground. Wang Yukai furrowed his brows. "Don't be disrespectful. This is my eldest brother." "I'm a bit surprised." "Cousin, who are you talking to? It can't be these 2 paper figurines, right?" Wang Yukai nodded lightly. Then he walked into the room. It seemed to be my cousin's voice. I turned around and found that the paper figures, who had been so proud just moments ago, were now humbly bowing their heads. Wow, so magical. I happily carried both paper figures to the shop entrance. These 2 are simply living advertisements. Just put it by the door. It's hard not to have booming business. At this time, the fortune teller came to the door. She was instantly stunned after seeing the 2 paper figures in front of the door. After regaining her composure, she thought they were left behind by the previous owner. She was just about to ask if there was any problem with the makeshift shrine, but she stopped abruptly upon seeing me. She scrutinized me in disbelief. "You invited the spirits to do things for you last night, didn't you?" "No. I was just sleeping last night." Grandma Wenmi doesn't believe me at all. "If you didn't ask the spirits for help, then why are you so drained? At this rate, you won't last long." I thought for a moment, then suddenly remembered. I told her about the hearse I saw last night. This time, it really left Grandma Wenmi dumbfounded. Are you saying that old lady Li died last night? Zhang Banxian was also in the car. I nodded affirmatively. It's a strange coincidence. A loud wail came from the distance. It was old lady Li's son. Old lady Li is dead. What about Zhang Banxian? Grandma Mi shook her head, sighed, and muttered to herself. A spirit carriage. How could something so sinister appear in this town? Could it be that many people are going to die again? Grandma Mi looked at me. She wanted me to tell old lady Li's last words to her family. Then, go to her shop to find her. She said that without Master Qing Feng, the mahal can't function properly. See if you can get a medium for me. I found it unusually dark inside, darker than Kong the coffin maker's shop. Black gauze hung on all four sides, wrapping the whole room tightly. 3 white candles burned on the table. A bowl of uncooked rice was placed in front. The fortune teller sat behind the table. Let me sit across from her. Ask Grandma Mi if I have the fate of the 5 ghosts' child. Who comes up later might not be what we expect. But we absolutely cannot ask how it died. If that thing possesses someone and doesn't want to leave, use the incense ash from the censer and apply it to Grandma's body. I see how dangerous what Grandma Lu said is. I want to tell her, maybe we should just give up. Old Lady Lu sighed and said the family line is incomplete. Sooner or later, it will end up like Zhang Banjian. Enough. Let's not talk about it. You, child, don't even know your own parents' birth dates. You'll have to ask for the blood rice. As Old Lady Lu spoke, she took a knife and made a cut on my finger. Use that bowl of uncooked rice to continue. Then let me use my bleeding fingers to mix the blood and rice. Keep my hands inside, I can't take them out. Then I closed my eyes. Grandma Lu took a grain of the bloody rice and stuck it to my forehead. She also lit 3 incense sticks and inserted them into the incense burner. My hands were placed flat on the table. I muttered something under my breath. General on horseback, lead the souls of the dead. Hurry, ride fast, quickly go. Please take me to the underworld to find the lost souls. After chanting several times, a cold wind began to blow from the back room. The white candle on the table went out, then reignited. The flame changed from yellow to a chilling green. Grandmother's face also turned an awful green. Her voice became ethereal, faint, and intermittent. Is it you, Quantum? Mom died so tragically. You must avenge Mom. I heard my mom's voice. I couldn't help but want to ask who did this to her. But then I remembered the advice from Grandma Mi. I forced myself to hold it in. Suddenly, a fierce cold wind rushed into my body. My consciousness began to blur. I bit my tongue to try and clear my head. But I was still beguiled. Mom, how did you die? Who killed you? I will avenge you. The moment I said those words, I knew I was in trouble. This was a taboo. I opened my eyes to see the medium's hands strangling my neck, and the female ghost's voice changed. Want to know how your mother died? Then go down and ask her yourself. I quickly dodged. I grabbed a handful of incense ash and threw it. The female ghost let out a painful scream, but to my surprise, the female ghost didn't leave the medium's body. Instead, she became even more frantic. It looked like she absolutely had to kill my mother-in-law and me. She reached out her hands and grabbed at me again. She was too fast, I couldn't dodge. The female ghost grabbed me by the neck and lifted me straight into the air. I tried hard to pry her hands open, but the female ghost was too strong. Her grip didn't loosen at all. Wang Yukai, sitting at the entrance of the paper money shop, seemed to sense something. He coldly glanced over here, then immediately stood up. With lightning speed, he charged into the rice shop. I fainted as soon as I vaguely saw the figure of the person arriving. Wang Yotsai's face was ice cold. He looked at the female ghost choking me. He spat out a single word. Leave. The once ferocious ghost woman let out a sharp scream and vanished. Grandma Wenmi and I had already fainted on the ground. Wang Yukai saw that the blood rice had scattered into a complex, by character. He thought for a moment and wiped the writing away. Then, he carried me back to the paper effigy shop. I opened my eyes. A large dog's face was just inches from mine. I quickly asked it how I got back. And I asked how the fortune teller was doing. Unexpectedly, the coffin shop owner, son, was also there. He brought me a bowl of water. He said the fortune teller was fine. After feeling a little relieved, I remembered something. Uncle Son, where's my cousin? Didn't you see him when you came? Shopkeeper's son was stunned. He said he hadn't seen anyone else in the shop. He was pulled there by the big yellow dog biting his trousers. He exclaimed that the big yellow dog was becoming more and more perceptive. After shopkeeper's son returned to his shop, I rode my old bicycle to find my cousin, but I searched the whole town and didn't see him. I had to return to the shop and wait for him to come back. Little did I know, before my cousin arrived, a group of unexpected guests showed up. An old man with a gloomy face walked up to me, followed by a few bald, burly men. All of them had strange tattoos on their necks. I suspected they were part of the same gang as that death row inmate. Knowing they were from the mafia, I didn't dare offend them. I quickly stood up, greeting them with a smile. This old man, and these older brothers. What's wrong? Did someone die in your family? Do you need to buy paper people and paper horses? These few people only came to scout the situation. But my words, once spoken, sounded like deliberate provocation to them. Several strong men coldly snorted and surrounded me. The old man stopped them. He looked at the two paper figures Wang Yukai had made in front of the door with a grave expression. After a moment, the old man clasped his fists in a bow. What skill! Connecting the living and the dead through paper. I didn't expect to meet such a master here. My incompetent disciples did not die in vain. Then the old man looked towards the inside of the shop. Upon seeing this, his expression grew even more grave. Since we're all insiders, old man, I'll speak plainly. As long as you return the spirit infant and the 7 calamity stones, the matter of killing my disciple will be wiped clean. How about it? I couldn't understand a word of what this old man was saying. At that moment, Big Yellow charged over. He started barking at the group. I quickly stopped him. Just as Big Yellow was charging over, strange noises came from the bags carried by several bald, burly men. They kept drumming. They seemed very uneasy. The old man frowned, puzzled. Clever dog. Then he sneered. If you don't want to negotiate, just say so. There's no need to unleash vicious dogs to chase away your guests. We'll meet again. Then the old man, accompanied by several big men, left angrily. I thought to myself, it's over. I've offended the mafia. I complained that De Huang had done something wrong. But De Huang just stared at me with a look of confusion. Not long after, another group of people arrived. It is the family members of those who were executed just this morning. I quickly greeted them with a smile. As soon as ordinary people arrived, they were drawn to the paper effigies at the door. The elder leading them was even more surprised. The elder respectfully clasped his fists and said, I was still thinking about how to discuss matters with the master here. Seeing that you're also from inside the door, I'll speak frankly. We cannot immediately return home with the joy spirit. I'd like them to rest on your land for a few days. I wonder if you could grant me this favor. I was confused again. What did he say? Actually, the old man was speaking in code. They are actually itinerant merchants. In the itinerant merchant community, they are called Lao Si. Their goods are called Shishen. Bringing the happiness god home is like bringing a corpse home. Seeing I didn't react, the old man thought I was unwilling to help. He quickly took out 5,000 yuan from his bag and offered it to me. His attitude respectful. He said there are 4 happiness gods, and they can only stay for 3 days at most. If it exceeds that, he'd give me an extra 1,000 yuan per day. I haven't had a proper meal, just barely scraping by. What does he even mean by the god of joy? When he saw me agree so readily, the old man couldn't help but laugh heartily. He said the god of joy will be sent over at midnight tonight. Just leave the back door open for them. Also, you need to keep an eye on your noble family's spiritual dog. If the spirit dog gets close, my customers will never get up again. After giving his instructions, the old man left with his people. It got dark, and Wang Yukai still hadn't returned. I was afraid he had been kidnapped by bad people. At 11 p.m., the customers from Badian arrived on time. They had changed into new outfits. His clothes were dark and loose. He held a pair of red-stringed copper bells in his left hand. In his right hand, he waved a triangular apricot yellow flag. I just found it strange. Those people placed the statue of the god of happiness against the wall. Then they covered it with a large rain cloth. I couldn't see what was inside at all. Seeing I wasn't asleep, the old man suggested we have a drink. We just started drinking in the backyard. The old man accidentally caught sight of the side room, where the ancestral tablets were enshrined. Something seemed odd. He almost spoke, but ultimately held back his words. The old man tentatively asked. Unexpectedly, the young man was not only a descendant of the paper-cutting lineage, but also a shamanic disciple. No wonder you have such profound cultivation. The voices of the evil spirits suddenly echoed in the old man's ears. Old man, you're just a passerby. We advise you not to meddle. Incense. These voices naturally came from those practitioners of the evil sect. Hearing this, the old man was greatly shocked. He couldn't help but glance towards the side room. I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Brother, you have no idea. I worship these immortals just to stay alive. The old man found this hard to believe. With such deep cultivation, he can only protect his life. What kind of terrifying enemies has he offended? I didn't expect these immortals to be so powerful. The old man dared not say another word. After finishing his drink, the old man stood up and took his leave. I saw him to the door. The old man looked around to make sure no one was watching. He pressed a square object into my hand. Then, lowering his voice, he whispered in my ear. This seal was given to me by a very powerful shamanic disciple. I never use it. I hope this thing can help you. I gratefully thanked him. After leaving the town, the young man behind the old man asked, Old master, that shopkeeper Zhao Yuliang just now. Hearing this, the old man immediately told him to stop. He looked back in alarm and said, some things are better left unsaid. Anyway, once we finish, let's leave quickly. It's best not to get involved. The young man asked again, then why did you give him the great seal just now? To an expert, that treasure is worth more than gold. The old man smiled faintly upon hearing this. As long as the young man from the paper shop survives the calamity, future achievements will definitely be extraordinary. Just consider it a good connection. The young man behind asked where to go next. The elder thought for a moment and said, let's go to the tomb and have a look. If we can find the 7 miserable stone, then there's hope. The young man was a bit confused. Wasn't the 7 miserable stone taken by the spellcaster? Why risk going to the tomb again? The old man shook his head and said, if the voodoo master had really obtained it, he would have run away by now. There must be something wrong. Meanwhile, deep in the mountains outside the town, stood a group of bald-headed gangsters. The elderly voodoo master sat in the middle. One of the big men in black couldn't help but ask, Elder, how could I not tell that the young man at the paper crafting shop is an old witch doctor? His expression is dark and grim. Do you know that the 2 spirit paper figures he placed in front of his door could only be made by a ghost that's at least 300 years old? Everyone present, all the witch doctors, were deeply shocked, but a few of them were still unwilling to accept it. Are you saying the 3 junior disciples just died for nothing? Are we giving up on the spirit infant and the 7 tragedy stone as well? The elderly sorcerer showed a fierce expression. If he is heartless, don't blame me for being ruthless. You 4, stay on alert. Xiao Wu, stay behind to help me with the curse. Upon hearing this, the others quickly took action. The elderly sorcerer chose an empty space. He placed candles around the positions of the pentagram. He took out a coffin nail. I pinned my photo to the center of the star array, and I smeared the back of the photo with crow's blood. Then I found a completely black cat with green eyes. I made the cat stare directly at the photo. After a moment, the elderly sorcerer suddenly reached out and grabbed the black cat's neck tightly. In pain, the black cat extended its claws and repeatedly scratched at the photo. Blood seeped from my mouth. It all fell onto the photograph. Meanwhile, I, who was burning incense for the shop's dolls, screamed and fell to the ground. Deep, bone-visible wounds appeared on my face, accompanied by a gush of blood, and the grinding of bones. I was writhing in pain on the ground. I struggled to get up, stumbling around in agony. There was a thud. I accidentally collided with the foot of a male figurine on the altar. I then passed out from the pain. The blood on the figurine was quickly absorbed. Then, an eerie laughter echoed from within the figurine. Meanwhile, deep in the mountains far away, the black cat is on the verge of death. I am also in the paper cutting shop. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blew in from nowhere. Instantly, it extinguished 7 white candles. This is bad. The old voodoo master shouted in alarm. He immediately spat out a large mouthful of black blood. The young man nearby rushed over in panic. Idiot! Don't mind me. Hurry up and light the candle. The old sorcerer curses loudly. Xiao Wu runs to the candle. But no matter how many times he tries, the flame is always blown out by the eerie wind. It's as if there's a strange dead spirit. The head is pressed against Xiao Wu's face, blowing cold air. This scene frightens Xiao Wu, leaving him at a loss. His face turns pale as he asks the elder what to do. The elderly spirit medium's expression is clearly no better than Xiao Wu's. Ghost blows the lantern. The 3 words are painfully spat out from the elder's mouth. A person has 3 lanterns of young fire. They are situated on top of the head. 2 more are on the shoulders. The evil things want to harm people. They must extinguish your young fire first. So if someone calls your name while you're walking at night, you must never turn around. Otherwise, your young fire will be blown out, and those things will cling to you. Xiao Wu's scalp tingled upon hearing this. Panicked, he ran to the elderly shaman's back. The elderly shaman cursed, useless. He took out 2 drops of human oil and applied them to his eyes. I'll see who the reckless ghost is. That ruined my good deed, and caused me to suffer backlash. However, to the elderly shaman's surprise, he saw nothing. The screams of his disciples came from nearby. The elderly sorcerer grew even more anxious. He shouted towards that direction. What's wrong? Did you see anything? But the only answer he received were more screams, one after another. In a flash, all the disciples fell silent. The last desperate scream was heard. Zombie, zombie household. Then that man's head was thrown to the feet of the elderly sorcerer. The elderly sorcerer hadn't come to his senses yet. Then, a zombie walked out from the woods, backward. Each step it took made a heavy sound. A backward walker. The elderly curse master stared in disbelief and exclaimed, how can there still be such a thing? He quickly reached for the tattoo on his neck. There was a blood-red scorpion tattooed there. He tore at the tattoo, along with the flesh in the scorpion. He shouted, Scorpion God, save me. The scorpion tattoo immediately swelled up. In the blink of an eye, it grew to the size of a basin. Then a series of rustling sounds were heard, rushing rapidly towards the backwards walker. However, just as it was about to make contact with the backwards walker's body, the backwards walker let out a sharp snap. Their head tilted backward, with the back of their head touching their heels. A terrifying woman's face appeared before them. Her complexion was ashen. His face was covered in blood. The scorpion god released by the old sorcerer was caught by the inverted walker. Then it was bitten into the inverted walker's mouth, followed by the sound of crunching and chewing. Pus splashed out from the inverted walker's mouth. The old sorcerer trembled and backed away. He glanced back at Xiao Wu, who was terrified. He pushed him in front of himself and ran away. The backwards walker bit Xiao Wu to death. He sneered and charged towards the elderly sorcerer. The backwards walker's posture remained unchanged. He crawled backwards using his hands and feet. Moments later, the elderly sorcerer screamed. He unwillingly fell to the ground slowly. In the backwards walker's hand was the elderly sorcerer's heart. And the heart is still beating. After killing everyone, the one walking backwards slowly leaves. My photo. Pinned with a coffin nail, was stepped on and carried away. When I woke up, I found Big Yellow pressing its face against mine. I thought it was the one that grabbed me last night. I couldn't help but complain a little. De Huang, however, glanced at me disdainfully before leaving. My cousin hasn't come back yet. I was thinking of asking Granny Wenmi to tell my fortune. But what I didn't know was, asking the spirits, Wenmi, and fortune-telling are different. Fortune-telling is for the living. Asking the spirits, Wenmi, is for the dead. After breakfast, I went to see Granny Wenmi. Granny Wenmi was startled when she saw me. Child, what's wrong with you again? Why do you look so unwell? Did something happen? I thought for a while and said, no. My face was scratched by a big yellow dog. Granny Wenmi wasn't ordinary. How could I not see the problem? He dragged me in. He took out a silver needle and inserted it into the gap between my fingernail. A drop of blood oozed out. It dripped into a bowl filled with rice, accompanied by a sizzling, burning sound. Black smoke immediately rose. You little brat. You've clearly been hexed. The fortune teller paced back and forth, increasingly anxious as she spoke. She was powerless against the hex. The fortune teller couldn't help but sigh. It's truly strange. Why are you so unlucky, child? Why does all the filth seem to stick to you? Though I've never actually met a real sorcerer, but I've seen a lot of movies and TV shows. Time is getting urgent. No way. Why would a sorcerer want to get rid of me? The fortune teller was equally puzzled. She decided to go back to the paper shop to check. I'm still worried about my cousin. So I asked the fortune teller if she could help me find him. I asked Grandmommy how she knew that I suddenly had a cousin. I told her everything. However, I wasn't sure about my cousin's background. So, I didn't go into details. Grandmommy said she would help later. What's important now is me. Then, she asked me to bring along manager's son from the coffin shop. We passed by the coffin shop. Shopkeeper's son is already standing at the door, curiously asking what we're doing. Grandmommy looks at him, her face full of surprise. Old son, what did you bump into last night? Your young energy is all drained. Shopkeeper's son lets out a bitter laugh. That's right. I also wanted to consult Grandmommy about the countermeasures. She immediately asked me what had happened again. Grandmommy sighed and said we should talk about it at the paper shop. No one can enter from the front. We went in through the back door. Grandmommy and manager's son immediately saw the four figures. The four joy gods. The quantum. How come you have something like this at home? You really dare to keep anything around you, huh? How would I know these are magical tools? I chuckled and explained the situation. I even took out the large seal the old man gave me. After carefully examining it, I returned it to Grandmommy. It really is an authentic immortal seal. It seems like they don't have bad intentions toward you. Let's go inside and take a look first. Although Grandmommy and shopkeeper's son searched thoroughly, this whole scene is truly just a misunderstanding. Naturally, they found nothing. The elderly couple, feeling helpless, could only enter the small house where the household deity is worshipped to light incense and make offerings. They hoped to ask this so-called evil deity if it knew anything. Suddenly, a few figures with crooked postures appeared on the memorial tablet. Leading the way was actually the grasshopper spirit that had previously resided on Zhang Banxian. It seems that only after Zhang Banxian's death did it come here to hold court. The grasshopper spirit's voice was as sharp as a whistle. It immediately started accusing the fortune teller, saying I spend all day with those spooky things, like dolls and paper effigies. They wouldn't dare to provoke me. Don't disturb their cultivation if there's nothing urgent. Grandmommy had no choice but to withdraw after asking. They can't help with my situation for now. Grandmommy then asked about what happened to shopkeeper's son. Shopkeeper's son said that when he was about to rest last night, someone knocked urgently on the door outside the yard. 3 strange figures stood outside the door, all wearing green robes and small hats. Makeup and attire from the Republican era. Shopkeeper's son was startled. He pretended to lead the 3 inside. Then he looked at them from behind. At this sight, shopkeeper's son jumped in fright. The 3 of them had ghastly pale faces. Their features were contorted. This is not an ordinary ghost. It's clearly an evil spirit. Shopkeeper's son didn't act hastily. He wanted to see the purpose of these evil spirits visiting in the middle of the night. The 3 spirits also realized that the other side had seen through them, but they didn't mind at all. Instead, they grinned at shopkeeper's son. Blood began to drip from their mouths. Shopkeeper's son asked about their purpose in coming. The taller ghost chuckled. To a coffin shop, of course, to order coffins, he said. 7 in total. 4 black ones, 3 white ones. All must be perfectly square. There can't be the slightest deviation. After speaking, the ghost pulled out several banknotes from the Republic of China era. He grabbed shopkeeper Sun's hand and shoved the money into it, waiting for shopkeeper Sun to accept the deposit. The three ghosts laughed even more eerily. They said to come back in 3 days to collect the coffin. If the coffin wasn't ready by then, he would definitely regret it. Then they floated out of the courtyard and disappeared. Shopkeeper Sun chuckled wryly and pulled out several banknotes from the Republic of China era. Grandmother Mi kept her eyes fixed on the bruise on Mr. Sun's wrist. The bruise was dark and shiny. At the same time, it seemed to exude a faint chill. It's a ghostly mark. Old Sun, they've left their mark on you. You can't escape it. Mr. Sun helplessly nodded. These three ghosts are incredibly powerful. I'm no match for them with my skill. If I, an old man, die, so be it. I'm just worried they'll continue to harm others. I curiously asked, how do you know they'll harm others? Shopkeeper Sun's smile grew even more bitter. Didn't they order 7 coffins? It's still such a spooky coffin. This brings us to the taboos of coffin makers. Generally, there are 5 colors of coffins: yellow, red, black, white, and gold. Black ones are prepared for those who died unnatural deaths, such as those who were murdered, committed suicide, or died young. White ones are for unmarried women or young people who died prematurely. The 3 evil spirits ordered 4 black coffins and 3 white coffins. This means at least 7 more people are going to die near the town, and they will all die violent deaths. In addition, the shape of the coffins they requested is simply horrifying. It's as if the dead will never be able to reincarnate. The coffins are all rectangular. One end is larger, the other smaller. The large end represents the yang. Only when yin and yang are in order can one bring prosperity to descendants. The deceased will have peace in the cycle of reincarnation. Inside the coffin, place. It's like a 4-character word. This word is a major taboo in feng shui. If this is done, the person's soul will not be able to enter the underworld. Once the soul lingers in the human world, it's like enduring constant torment. Even the kindest soul, after suffering so much, will eventually turn into a malevolent ghost that harms everyone. After hearing Sun, the shopkeeper's explanation, I was immediately furious. Damn it, those 3 ghosts are incredibly wicked. He anxiously asked if there was any way to deal with them. Store manager Sun helplessly glanced at Granny Mi, who was standing nearby. Granny Mi sighed and spoke up. She said her abilities were only slightly better than store manager Sun's. They were both just century-old ghosts after all. She could manage 1, but 3 at once, no matter how hard she tried, was impossible. I asked cautiously, can Uncle Sun and Granny Lu each handle 1? I'll have the immortals in the hall deal with the remaining 1. Granny Mi shook her head and sighed. Those evil immortals from the hall are fine when they encounter a small ghost or something, but if they run into a tough opponent, they'll run faster than anyone. They might even team up with the evil ghosts to deal with us. Then we're really done for. I felt downhearted. Does that mean we can't do anything about those 3 evil spirits? No way. We can't just let them harm Uncle Sun. A strange look flashed across the face of the other shopkeeper, Sun, but it quickly settled down. Uncle Sun reassured me, saying he'd already come to terms with it. He told me not to worry. He said that. I felt even more strongly that good people shouldn't die young. In a moment of desperation, I suggested whether we could ask the Wong Tai Sin who saved me for help. The 2 elders really had no other options. They said we could only try. But then I started having trouble figuring out where to go. I asked Grandma Mi, and she suggested going to Judaega village. Maybe we could find the head of the 5 great shaman families there. There are memorial tablets in Judaega village. The small courtyard in Judaega village is a sacred place for practitioners from the northern regions. Since the elders can't go, I have to go. It's forbidden to stray too far from the shop. I asked Grandma Mi, and she said it could be temporarily resolved. Before I left, Grandma Lu gave me a piece of talisman paper. She reminded me to keep it on me. This talisman only works for 1 day. Make sure to be back before midnight tonight. Also, once we leave the town, no matter what happens, don't look back. After I nodded in agreement, I took a taxi and hit the road. When the car drove out of the town limits, I suddenly felt a heaviness in my head, as if I was in a half-sleep, half-awake state. Immediately, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. It was the same as last time, and as my face turned pale and I struggled to breathe, the charm given by Granny Wen suddenly shone brightly. I immediately felt much better. I gasped for breath. Suddenly, familiar voices called out to me from behind. It was my sister. I have my own adoptive father, and my own biological mother. I couldn't help but look back. Fortunately, I remembered to ask about Grandma Mi's advice in time. I stopped paying attention to those voices. Just as I breathed a sigh of relief, my body began to move uncontrollably, like a puppet on a string. I turned my head slightly. No matter how much I struggle, it's useless. I only see the pair of figurines that are offered daily, becoming unusually large. They float above the town. The man's face is covered in stitch marks, thick, large, and twisted. It's as if it's crawling with snails. A woman dressed in ancient bridal attire was murmuring as she sang Peking opera. They kept waving at me, urging me to return. I felt more and more dizzy, as if my body was about to float away, just as my soul was about to leave my body. In my dazed state, I seemed to see my cousin, Wang Yukai. Then, I regained my senses. I looked behind me, still shaken. All those things had disappeared. Wang Yukai was gone too. I shook my head, thinking it must all have been a dream. When I arrived at the Jodaogo village that Granny Lu had mentioned, I was stunned. There was no village here. It was clearly a large construction site. After asking a worker, I found out. They planned to relocate here. The villagers had already moved out long ago. I quickly asked him if he knew where they had moved to. The worker shook his head and said he didn't know. When we arrived at the old site of the courtyard, it was completely flattened. Though deeply disappointed, I still bowed 3 times deeply towards the front. Thinking I didn't have much time, I turned back. After walking a few steps, I felt something under my feet. I picked it up and took a look. It was a miniature little wooden knife. There was a line of particularly ugly small characters carved on it. Some characters even had pinyin annotations. Little knife, jingle jangle. Specifically for stabbing the 8th master's crotch. Oh yeah, I thought it was a child's toy. I almost threw it away, but in the end, I carefully put the wooden sword close to my body. After I left, 2 strange sounds suddenly came from the ruins of the small courtyard. I returned to the paper-making shop before dark. I told my parents what happened. They were all a little disappointed. The fortune teller said she would go and cook for me. Shopkeeper's son also came to comfort me. Then I suddenly remembered something. Uncle, this morning you said, the ghost needs 7 coffins, right? Yes. What's wrong? I couldn't help but take a deep breath. I asked Uncle's son if he remembered the incident on the purple bus. You know, the one with Grandma Li. Master Zhang was also on it. Uncle's son said, of course he remembered something so creepy. I couldn't help but shudder and said, if I remember correctly, there were exactly 7 seats in the carriage at that time. What the heck? Is it that spooky? Shopkeeper's son was also stunned. He then lowered his head and began to ponder with a serious expression. Logically, the ghost carriage belongs to the underworld. Then how could those 3 evil spirits be connected to the underworld? At this time, the elderly traveler came to the door. He already knew the rules of the paper shop, so he didn't enter directly. I invited him in. The old corpse herder could tell that manager's son was also from within the door. He couldn't help but be a little curious. After a brief introduction between the two, the old corpse herder noticed that manager's son had weak yang energy and some toxic substance in his body. Although he has limited skills, he can still clear the household poison. The old corpse handler was referring to the household poison, which refers to the after effects of the mud smeared on the eyes by storekeeper's son. Storekeeper's son immediately felt a surge of joy. He took off his thick sunglasses, revealing a pair of bright green eyes. Even the well-read old man couldn't help but gasp. Such intense resentment, coupled with the poison. It's the first time I've seen anything like it in all my years. Luckily, we discovered it early. If it had been a few more days, even the legendary Deluo immortals wouldn't have been able to save him. The elderly man hurried Mr. Sun outside the shop. He took a box of ancient needles from his bag. He quickly inserted a needle into Mr. Sun's Yangbai acupoint, Qingming, Yuyo, and other points, chanting incantations softly. Yin returns to Yin, Yang returns to Yang. Yin and Yang each on their own side. Life and death, 2 separate paths. Do not hurry when walking. She grabs a handful of prepared glutinous rice mixed with rootless water, turning it into a rice paste. After wrapping the glutinous rice paste with a wet cloth. After a short while, the green in shopkeeper's son's eyes started to move upwards, along his forehead to the top of his head. When all the green poison had been completely absorbed by the glutinous rice, the old corpse raiser finally let out a long sigh of relief, saying that the poison had been completely removed. But at this moment, shopkeeper's son felt a chill spread throughout his body. Even the corpse-repelling elder and I felt it. A creaking sound came from inside the room. All the paper figures turned their gaze towards us. They stared intently at the corpse-repelling elder. The peaking opera melody echoed again. This time, it was even colder. It felt even more ethereal. I called the ghost servant to drive the Yin wind to the shrine. Upon seeing the shrine, I couldn't help but feel heartbroken. The smoker entered the shrine. He examined it with his eyes. 3 bowls of food were offered, but there were only 2 bowls of soup. The dish was wilted cabbage. The soup was just plain water. A sinister voice came from the offering. Female doll. Outsider, why are you interfering? Aren't you afraid of dying? The corpse handler was startled. He instinctively took several steps back. Even the mighty can manifest and cause trouble. Boss Zhao, what exactly are you hiding in your shop? I'm a victim of the shop myself. How would I know that much? But I still stood in front of the elderly man, and started threatening him. Sister, what are you trying to do? If you're hurting others, I won't come and offer incense for you in the middle of the night anymore. But then, the things inside actually fell silent. The old man finally breathed a sigh of relief. He gratefully thanked me. Suddenly, the old man's face changed drastically as he stared at the paper shop. Such a heavy corpse stench. You wouldn't tell me. That the whole shop is built with human flesh and blood mud? How many people must have died for that? How many vengeful spirits are trapped inside? Storekeeper's son gave a deep look at the paper offering shop. He still told them the strange happenings of the shop, but he only gave a general overview. The old man from the village was greatly shocked after hearing it. No wonder this shop was built in such a dangerous location. No wonder it required a young and talented person like the owner to manage it. Now the old man was even more certain that he was a person of great skill. Only someone with extraordinary skills would dare stay in such a creepy place. I curiously asked the old man about his purpose for coming here. The old man took out a thick wad of 100 yuan bills and handed them to me. He said his client wanted to stay here a few more days. If he doesn't come by in 5 days, then I should find a place to bury him. The extra 5,000 will be considered burial expenses. What the heck? Buried? Old brother, what exactly is it that you left with me? As the old woman walked out, she couldn't help but laugh softly. Of course, it's a corpse. I was completely dumbfounded. Seeing the elderly man look like he was leaving his final words, the shopkeeper's son couldn't help but ask what happened. After all, the corpse carrier saved his life. Perhaps he can lend a hand if there's something. The corpse carrier pondered before speaking. 3 of you. Have you heard of the 7 Miseries Stone? To speak of the 7 Miseries Stone, I must first tell a story. In ancient times, there was an official named Yu Hongtu. He was framed by his own concubine and servant. The emperor ordered the punishment of decapitation. The major organs of the human body are in the upper half. The executed criminals often remain conscious for a long time. Some criminals even have their upper bodies placed in lard, to prevent blood from flowing out. They are tortured even longer. It can be said to be extremely cruel. Yu Hongtu was treated this way. He watched helplessly as his life slowly slipped away. For a full 3 hours. In the end, he dipped his hand in his own blood, and wrote the word tragedy 7 times on the ground before he died. These 7 tragedies transformed into the 7 tragedies of Yu Hongtu. He asked the old woman if they were going to the tomb. As far as she knew, that evil stone was in Yu Hongtu's tomb. The corpse driver elder nodded. He said the 7 tragic stones were very important to them. They must find it. After hearing this, storekeeper's son said, he was willing to join them in entering the tomb. The corpse driver elder had saved his life. The tomb is dangerous. He would help as much as he could. We chatted for a while. The old village head also learned about the 3 evil spirits. He then discussed with Sun, the shopkeeper, asking for his help in dealing with the 3 evil spirits. They would then descend into the tomb together. At this time, the big yellow dog entered the house with a dirty rag in its mouth. The fortune teller looked at the rag with curiosity. Let me take a look. Granny Wenmi was stunned as she took it. She then handed it to the coffin shop's manager Sun and the elder of the household. Manager Sun smiled and said, this is truly a treasure. It's the celestial flag of the exorcist family. Although they didn't know where the big yellow one came from, Granny Wenmi immediately took it to clean thoroughly. After it was cleaned, she ironed it and scented it. Then, she respectfully placed it under the ancestral tablet for worship. I curiously asked storekeeper's son what the immortal flag is. This treasure is really impressive. Storekeeper's son smiled and explained. There are 4 treasures that are indispensable in a legitimate faction. They are the order, flag, seal, and sword. The old corpse driver Fan Tian gave me a large seal before. Today, Brother Go brought me the immortal flag. Now I have 2 of them. It's a pity we can't find a proper immortal family to offer sacrifices to. Shopkeeper's son comforted me, saying, as for the other Lingi sword, Uncle will definitely try his best to find a way to get it for you. After dinner, Madame Wenmi and the others left together. They said they needed to guard against those 3 evil spirits who had their coffins prepared. I couldn't help but think of Wang Yukai. Oh my, it's been 3 days already. Where on earth has my cousin gone? I really hope nothing has happened to him. I lit incense for the offering doll. It's already past midnight. Then a knock was heard at the back door. I was overjoyed, thinking my cousin had returned. But just as I was about to open the door, I sensed something was wrong. It was unusually cold around me. A cold that went right to the bone. And the evil spirits I worshipped were all huddled on their tablets, shivering, as if something terrifying was outside. While I was wondering about this, singing came from outside. I'm the greatest in both the yin and yang worlds. If I order you to be born, you'll be born. If Yama decrees death at the 3rd watch, who dares to keep anyone alive until the 5th? The moment the singing started, the terror on the faces of all the evil spirits and immortals intensified. They actually screamed and scattered in all directions. Seeing this, I fearfully and slowly backed away. The big yellow dog suddenly ran over. The dog's eyes were fixed on me. In its gaze, there was both fear and a deep sense of reluctance toward me. This scene made me even more nervous. What's wrong, buddy? Please stop looking at me like that. I'm kind of scared here. Maybe I wanted some comfort. Instinctively, I took out the wooden knife I had picked up earlier in the day. I gripped it tightly in my hand. I don't know if it was a coincidence, but the strange knocking sound suddenly stopped. There was no more sound after that. I quickly picked up the big yellow dog and ran back to my room. When morning came, cries suddenly echoed from all directions in the town. Everyone was heartbroken. Some were crying for their sons, others for their daughters. I suddenly thought of the 7 coffins set by the 3 evil ghosts. This is bad. Could it be that something evil is hurting people? I ran towards the nearest sound of crying to check, but the big yellow dog grabbed my pant leg and pulled me back with force. Forced to return to the paper shop, the old coffin carrier walked over with a grim expression. I quickly asked him what had happened. The old coffin carrier was clearly stunned. He asked me if I hadn't heard the commotion last night. I said I only heard someone knocking on my door last night. That was it. The old coffin carrier sighed. What else could it be? Something dirty. I guess it's those 3 dirty things that haunted the coffin. Even he, the fortune teller, and the shopkeeper's son couldn't stop them. In the second half of last night, the corpse carrier's compass suddenly spun rapidly. After a moment, the needle pointed straight north. Shopkeeper's son said he'd go take a look. He held a wooden mallet in one hand and a coffin nail in the other, and headed straight toward the direction with the heaviest sinister energy. Shopkeeper's son walked nearby, and heard a woman cry out in surprise. "Child, what's wrong with you? You can't eat your own flesh." Shopkeeper's son quickly jumped into the yard. He saw a child about 6 or 7 years old, standing in the yard with a pale green face. What's terrifying is, he keeps gnawing on his left arm, gnawing it until it's drenched in blood. Even with the bones exposed, he doesn't feel any pain. He gnaws while sneering coldly. Whenever someone tries to approach, they are pushed back by an invisible force. His parents sat on the ground in despair, crying and calling out. The boy's father, seeing manager's son enter, knelt on the ground, begging manager's son to save his son. He said the child seemed to be possessed. Manager's son hurriedly took out a chalk line, and drew a circle around the child. The little boy watched his actions but remained unmoved, continuing to bite his own arm. The smile became colder and more sinister. The coffin seller. You're not at home waiting to die properly, yet you dare to come out and meddle. Are you trying to die even faster? The voice of a middle-aged man came from the boy's throat. Hearing that familiar voice, shopkeeper's son was sure it was those 3 evil spirits causing trouble. Waiting to die. But it's not necessarily me, the old man, who's going to die. Shopkeeper's son pulls the ink line into a writing shape. A few drops of ink shoot toward the boy. The boy possessed by a ghost immediately lets out a miserable scream. But the boy doesn't stop moving. Instead, he gnaws even faster. In the blink of an eye, there was hardly any flesh left on his left arm. All that's left are the broken bones. His stomach is so swollen it could burst at any moment. Even so, the little boy still isn't full. He actually shoved his finger bones into his mouth, gnawing them with a crunching sound. Under the watchful eyes of everyone, he swallowed all 10 of his finger bones. The boy's mother couldn't bear it and rushed towards him, crying out to spare her child. The boy let out a violent shout. It was as if the child's mother was struck by an invisible giant foot. The boy gritted his teeth. Now you know how it feels to hurt. Now you know fear. How did you treat us back then? We will return everything today. The little boy smiled as he put his right arm into his mouth and continued to gnaw. Fresh blood kept flowing from the corner of his mouth. It looked extremely terrifying. Shopkeeper's son trembled with anger when he saw this. He wrapped the ink line around his body. Then, he raised the wooden mallet and struck it toward the boy's head. Even so, the evil spirit still refused to leave the boy's body. Master's son knew that if this continued, the boy would die. He had no choice but to take out a coffin nail and stab it into the boy's left shoulder. Immediately, black smoke began to rise. The evil spirit screamed in agony. It glared at Master's son with a look of hatred. It continued to gnaw at its own right arm. Shopkeeper's son grew even more anxious. Another coffin nail pierced the boy's right shoulder. Simultaneously, he grabbed the other's arm and pulled hard. Monster, stop it. The evil spirit let out a strange, eerie laugh. Finally, it left the little boy. But when Shopkeeper's son looked again, the little boy had already stopped breathing. I anxiously asked what happened afterward. The old man from the village said their abilities were insufficient. They couldn't stop the 3 evil spirits. 3 children died last night. When Granny Me was saving one of the children, she got injured. I worriedly asked if Granny was alright. At that moment, manager's son came over to support Granny Me. Grandmother said she's fine. She just couldn't save that poor child. She's feeling upset. After I told them about the knocking on the door last night, Grandmother, with tears in her eyes, gently stroked my head. This really is a case of misfortune never coming alone. The ones who came for you weren't those 3 evil spirits. It was. My mother-in-law couldn't bear to say any more. Shopkeeper's son helplessly told me. It was the paper-making shop's backlash. Quant, it seems your lifespan is exhausted. Or rather, it's been completely drained by something in the paper-making shop. I abruptly stood up. No way. Didn't you say I still had more than 10 days to live? At this moment, I suddenly remembered again. The knocking sound from last night only lasted for a while. After that, it stopped. The elderly people also found it strange. They couldn't understand it. Everyone shifted their thoughts back to the 3 evil spirits. The elder from the village couldn't help but ask. Those 3 evil spirits seem to be here for revenge. Did the townspeople harm them in the past? The fortune teller and the shopkeeper's faces fell. They couldn't help but repeatedly glance towards the paper shop. After a long while, the fortune teller sighed and said, "It's been too many years. We don't know much about it." Then she persuaded the corpse walker to just leave. Stay out of this mess. But just then, the two paper figures I'd left by the door suddenly moved. They all stared in unison towards the town entrance. The fortune teller and I were all startled. We couldn't help but follow the direction of the paper figures' gaze.